There's an uncomfortable truth about intelligence that most people never talk about. The smarter you are, the harder it often becomes to truly connect with others. Not because you're better than them, but because the way you think, question things, and process the world slowly separates you from the crowd. And if you've ever felt like you don't quite belong anywhere, there might be a deeper reason for that.
You've probably been told your whole life that intelligence is an advantage. That thinking deeply, questioning things, seeing complexity where others see simplicity, that these are gifts. And in some ways, they are. But there's a shadow side no one talks about. The smarter a person becomes, the more isolated they often feel. Not because they want to be alone, but because something keeps happening around them that they can't fully explain. Conversations go shallow the moment they try to go deep. Rooms shift when they walk in. People they respect suddenly become distant. And somewhere along the way, many of them start wondering if the problem is them. It isn't. But the real answer is darker than most people are prepared to hear. Here's what's actually happening. You've probably noticed it in a specific kind of moment. A conversation starts to go somewhere real. Someone raises an idea that actually requires thought. And then, almost immediately, something changes in the room. Someone makes a joke. Someone checks their phone. Someone steers it back toward something lighter, something safer. The depth disappears. And you're left standing in the shallow end, wondering how you got there. This isn't a coincidence. It isn't rudeness. It is a psychological reflex, automatic, unconscious, and almost universal. And once you understand what's driving it, you'll never see social dynamics the same way again. The conventional explanation is that intelligent people are simply hard to relate to. That they use complex language, or talk about things other people don't care about, or come across as arrogant. Sometimes that's true. But it's not the core of the problem. The core of the problem goes deeper, into something most people would prefer not to look at directly. Intelligence doesn't threaten people's understanding. It threatens their self-image. When someone in a room is thinking at a noticeably different level, it creates a kind of mirror. And in that mirror, people catch a glimpse of their own intellectual limitations. Maybe they realize they've never really examined a belief they hold. Maybe they sense that this person sees something they've been missing. Maybe they can't follow the argument, and that gap, small as it may be, produces a feeling that is deeply uncomfortable. Not frustration. Not curiosity. Fear. And this is where the neuroscience becomes genuinely disturbing. Studies on social cognition and threat response have found that intellectual inferiority, or simply the perception of it, activates the same neural pathways as physical danger. The amygdala lights up. Cortisol rises. The brain shifts into a defensive posture. All because someone in the room is thinking more carefully than you are. This is not a flaw in certain people. This is a feature of the human nervous system, shaped by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution in which social hierarchies were matters of life and death. The brain learned to read anything that could lower your status in the group as a threat to survival. And intelligence, real, visible, unapologetic intelligence, is one of the most potent status signals that exists. Which means the people who avoid you aren't being irrational. From their nervous system's perspective, they're protecting themselves. What they're protecting themselves from is the discomfort of being seen, in that mirror, as less than they want to be. Now here's the part that most people in this situation get wrong. They assume the problem is that others haven't caught up yet. That if they're patient, or if they explain things more clearly, the gap will close. What they don't realize is that the gap isn't primarily intellectual. It's emotional. And emotional gaps don't close through explanation. They close, if they close at all, through trust, through time, through the rare experience of feeling genuinely safe with someone who sees more than you do. That kind of safety is hard to build. And most of history's most brilliant minds never fully figured out how to build it. Socrates spent his life asking questions. Not to humiliate anyone. Not to demonstrate superiority. but because he genuinely believed that an unexamined life, a life where beliefs are inherited rather than tested, was a kind of slow intellectual death. He wanted people to think, to question, to become more fully themselves through honest inquiry. And for this, he was put on trial, charged with corrupting the youth of Athens, found guilty by a jury of his peers, and sentenced to drink poison. What is remarkable about this is not the injustice of it, though it was deeply unjust. What is remarkable is that the people who condemned him were not tyrants. They were ordinary citizens. People who, under different circumstances, might have been his students, his neighbors, his friends. But in the moment of the trial, what they experienced was not a wise man offering them a gift. They experienced something that made them feel small. And they responded the way humans almost always respond to that feeling. They destroyed the source of it. Galileo's story follows the same pattern. He looked through his telescope and saw what was actually there: moons orbiting Jupiter, phases of Venus, a solar system organized around the sun rather than the Earth. He wrote it down. He shared it. He was not interested in destroying anyone's worldview. He was interested in describing reality accurately. But reality, in this case, contradicted the official cosmology of the most powerful institution in the Western world. And so the institution did what institutions do when confronted with threatening truth: it forced him to recant, to publicly deny what he had seen with his own eyes, to stand before the church and say that the earth does not move. He was 70 years old. He had spent his life looking at the sky. And in the end, they made him lie about it. Tesla's trajectory is perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. Not because of what was done to him by others, though Morgan's withdrawal of funding and Edison's deliberate sabotage were genuine cruelties, but because of how he died. Not in poverty exactly, but in isolation. In a small hotel room in New York. His notebooks confiscated. His work misunderstood or ignored. A man who had dreamed of giving the world free energy, who had held in his mind systems more sophisticated than anything his contemporaries could follow, dying alone in a city that had moved on without him. He was not defeated by stupidity. He was defeated by the gap between what he could see and what the world was willing to receive. These are not ancient stories. They are the same story, repeating. Because the mechanism that destroyed Socrates and Galileo and Tesla does not require exceptional cruelty. It doesn't require conspiracy or malice. It requires only the ordinary human instinct to protect one's sense of self from anything that challenges it. And that instinct is as active today as it was in ancient Athens. Look at what actually spreads on social media. It's not complexity. It's not nuance. It's not the ideas that require you to hold two contradictory things in your mind simultaneously while you slowly work toward a more honest picture. Those ideas exist. They're being written and thought and argued in rooms most people never enter. But they don't spread. Because spreading requires an emotional trigger, outrage, inspiration, validation, fear, and complexity rarely produces those triggers cleanly. What spreads is certainty. Short, confident, emotionally resonant certainty. It doesn't matter if it's accurate. It matters that it feels true in a very immediate, low-effort way. This is not a new problem. Every era has had its equivalent of the viral shallow take, the pamphlet designed to inflame rather than illuminate, the political slogan that activates rather than informs. But the scale is new. The speed is new. And the result is an information environment that is, at the structural level, systematically hostile to depth. Which creates a trap. The person who thinks carefully and sees complexity is not only less understood in direct social situations, they're also less amplified by the systems that distribute ideas. They're operating at a disadvantage that isn't about the quality of their thinking. It's about the architecture of the world they're thinking in. And here is where the real question begins: what do you actually do with this? The first thing, and this requires a kind of intellectual humility that is much harder than it sounds, is to stop conflating depth with communication. The ability to think at a high level and the ability to make that thinking accessible to others are two completely different skills. They don't automatically come together. Many of the most profound thinkers in history were also genuinely poor communicators, not because their ideas weren't valuable, but because they had never developed the discipline of translating internal complexity into external clarity. And so their depth became a wall rather than a door. Einstein, who understood this, put it simply: if you can't explain something to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it well enough yourself. This is harder than most people admit, because it requires you to strip away the vocabulary and the structure that makes you feel sophisticated, and to find the thing underneath, the actual insight, the raw idea before the packaging. Most people resist this. They confuse simplification with dumbing down. They're not the same. Simplification is finding the essential shape of a complex thing. Dumbing down is removing the complexity to avoid discomfort. One is an act of generosity. The other is an act of condescension. The second thing is to make peace with the fact that not everyone is the right audience. This sounds obvious. But most deeply thoughtful people have not actually made this peace. They still feel, on some level, the quiet frustration of being in a room where no one engages with them at the level they're capable of. And that frustration is legitimate, it's a real loss, but it becomes corrosive if it defines how they see every room they enter. The room is not failing you. The room is simply not the right room. And there are other rooms. Throughout history, the people who maintained both intellectual depth and genuine connection found ways to build what we might call the right container. Socrates had his symposia, small groups of people who came specifically to think together. The Bloomsbury Group gathered in London in the early 20th century around the same principle, that certain kinds of thinking could only happen in the company of certain kinds of people. The Vienna Circle, the Inklings, the Salons of Enlightenment Paris. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate constructions. People who understood that depth requires an ecosystem, and who took the trouble to build one rather than waiting to find one. The same principle applies now. You are not going to find your equivalent of the symposia by accident. You find it by deciding it matters enough to look for, and then looking specifically and persistently rather than generally and passively. The third thing, and this is perhaps the most uncomfortable, is to examine whether the isolation you feel is entirely external in origin. Because not all of it is. Some of what gets mistaken for the world's failure to understand you is, in reality, a failure to be fully present with the people in front of you. A way of being half in the conversation and half in your own analysis of it. A habit of correcting rather than engaging. A tendency to treat social situations as problems to be solved rather than experiences to be had. These patterns are common in people who are accustomed to leading with intellect. And they create distance that has nothing to do with the other person's capacity for depth. This is the part no one in this situation wants to hear. Because the narrative of the misunderstood genius is, on some level, comfortable. It explains the pain without requiring anything to change. But the people throughout history who both thought deeply and remained genuinely connected to other humans, E. Montaigne, Marcus Aurelius, Darwin in his long correspondence with other naturalists, even Lincoln in his extraordinary friendships, they had something beyond intellectual capacity. They had genuine curiosity about other people. Not about people as mirrors for their own ideas, but about people as they actually were, complicated, often irrational, frequently wrong, and endlessly worth understanding. That curiosity is what makes depth connective rather than isolating. And it can be cultivated. It's not a personality trait you either have or you don't. It's a practice. It's the habit of asking a question and actually waiting for the answer. Of slowing down long enough to find out what the person in front of you actually thinks, not what you expect them to think. Of being genuinely surprised, sometimes, by what you discover. History does show one pattern with unusual consistency. Nearly every idea that was first rejected as too complex, too threatening, too ahead of its time, eventually became obvious. Obvious enough that people forgot it had ever been controversial. Obvious enough that the people who had resisted it most fiercely became the ones who claimed to have always understood it. This is cold comfort in the short term. It doesn't help Galileo, who died under house arrest. It doesn't help Tesla, who died alone. The vindication came too late to matter to them personally. But it contains a piece of genuine wisdom that is worth holding onto. The distance you feel from the world around you, that sense of operating at a frequency that doesn't quite match the ambient noise, that distance is not always a sign that something is wrong with you. Sometimes it's a sign that you're simply earlier than the room you're standing in. Not better. Not superior. Earlier. And earlier is a position that is lonely, and sometimes dangerous, and occasionally the most important place to be. If you have ever felt that your thoughts make you a stranger in your own life, consider the possibility that you have not found the right life yet. Not because you are waiting for the world to catch up, that kind of waiting is corrosive, but because the life that fits the way you think is something that usually has to be built rather than found. And building it requires the same thing that every difficult thing requires, the willingness to start from where you actually are, with what you actually have, in the direction of what you actually want. The depth is not the problem. It never was. The only question is what you do with it. Leave one thought in the comments. Not a question. A thought. Something you've held for a long time that you've rarely found the right room to say out loud. You'll see it reflected back by people you've never met. And that recognition, that moment of being genuinely seen by a stranger, is one of the few things that makes the distance worth it.